Welcome to another deep dive, everybody. Today we're going to be looking at something that I know a lot of you are really fascinated by,
Yeah.
and you've sent in a ton of articles and videos about this, and that is city grids.
Okay.
Um, on the surface they seem pretty simple, just a bunch of straight lines and right angles,
Right.
but
Yeah.
it looks like there's a lot more to this story than meets the eye.
Oh, absolutely. There's a ton of debate about the pros and cons.
Yeah, what are some of the things that surprised you when you were looking at all this stuff?
I think the biggest surprise for me was how far back the history of grids goes.
Oh, really?
People tend to think of them as like a modern invention, but
Right, like something that came about with like the Industrial Revolution or something.
yeah, exactly. But the truth is they go back thousands of years.
Wow. So like ancient civilizations were using grids.
Yeah, and not just using them, like they were really sophisticated with them. One of the sources you sent mentioned Mohenjo-daro.
Oh yeah, that's that ancient city in what's now Pakistan.
Right, built around 2500 BC.
2500 BC. That's mind-blowing.
It really is. And what's amazing about Mohenjo-daro is that its grid system was aligned with the cardinal directions.
So like north, south, east, west.
Exactly, which suggests a deep understanding of astronomy and a desire to create a city that was in harmony with nature.
Hmm. So it wasn't just about practicality?
No, it was about worldview. It was about creating a city that reflected a certain understanding of the cosmos.
That's so interesting. It makes you realize that grids aren't just about straight lines and efficiency.
Right, there's a deeper meaning there.
Yeah, like a symbolic dimension.
Exactly. And that's something that often gets lost in modern discussions about grids.
Yeah, we tend to think of them in very functional terms.
Right. But the ancients saw them as much more than that.
So Mohenjo-daro had this grid aligned with the stars.
Yeah.
What else was going on in that city?
Well, it also had a complex sewage system and well-planned public spaces.
Oh, wow. So they were thinking about sanitation and community well-being.
Exactly. They were way ahead of their time in many ways.
Makes you wonder what we've lost along the way, right?
Yeah, for sure.
So we've got grids in ancient India. What about other parts of the ancient world?
Well, the Romans were also big fans of the grid.
Rome.
Yeah, they were known for their efficiency and organization, and their cities reflect that.
That makes sense. I mean, they built this huge empire.
Exactly, and grids helped them do that. Their cities, like Timgad in Algeria, were built on a standardized grid based on military camps.
Military camps.
Yeah, it was all about rapid expansion and control.
So the grid was like a tool of empire.
In a way, yes. It allowed them to quickly establish new settlements and impose their order on conquered territories.
So there's that tension, again, efficiency on one hand, but maybe at the expense of something else on the other.
Yeah, that's a theme that runs throughout the history of the grid.
It makes you think about the trade-offs involved in any urban design choice.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've gone from ancient India to the Roman Empire. Let's jump ahead a few centuries. What about the grid in America?
Well, America's a really interesting case study because the grid played a central role in shaping the country.
Yeah, I remember learning about that in school, like how Thomas Jefferson was a big proponent of the grid system.
Exactly. He saw it as a symbol of order and democracy, a way to divide land fairly and create a sense of equality.
That's a very American ideal, right?
It is, and it's reflected in the way many American cities were laid out.
Like Philadelphia.
Yeah, Philadelphia is a classic example. William Penn designed the city on a grid in the late 17th century.
And then a bit later you have Savannah, Georgia.
Right, Savannah's grid is another great example. It was designed by James Oglethorpe in the 1730s.
And of course, this model was used for westward expansion.
Exactly as the country grew, the grid was seen as the most efficient and equitable way to divide up the land.
You'd think a system designed for equality would be a positive thing.
You would, but like we've seen with the Romans, even well-intentioned designs can have unintended consequences.
So what went wrong with the grid in America?
Well, one of the biggest criticisms is that it played a role in displacing Native American communities.
Oh, right. Because the grid facilitated the division and distribution of land that often belonged to indigenous peoples.
Exactly. The grid was a tool that was used to impose a certain vision of order on the landscape, and that vision often clashed with the existing ways of life of indigenous peoples.
So the grid becomes this instrument of power, in a way.
It can be, yes. It's a reminder that even seemingly neutral design choices can have political implications.
It's all about who's wielding the tool and for what purpose.
Exactly.
So the grid has this long and complicated history. But then in the 20th century, something happens that really puts it to the test.
You're talking about the rise of the automobile.
Exactly. Suddenly everyone has a car, and cities built for walking start to feel very different.
Yeah, the car changed everything. It exposed the limitations of the grid in a way that no one had anticipated.
So what were those limitations?
Well, the uniformity of the grid, which was great for walking, led to traffic congestion and safety concerns as car ownership exploded.
Right, because suddenly every street is a potential thoroughfare.
Exactly. And the quiet, walkable neighborhoods that grids were initially intended for started to disappear.
And that's where the suburbs come in. Right. A way to escape the chaos of the grid.
In a way, yes. In the 1920s, there was this huge shift in thinking. Planners started to favor designs that discouraged through traffic and promoted a sense of seclusion.
Like cul-de-sacs.
Exactly. The cul-de-sac became incredibly popular. It offered this sense of safety and a return to nature aesthetic that contrasted with the perceived rigidity of the grid.
So the grid gets blamed for the problems created by cars.
Yeah, it's ironic in a way because the grid was originally designed for pedestrians.
Right, it was all about walkability.
Exactly. But then the car comes along and suddenly the grid is seen as the enemy of good urban design.
And we see this shift towards a different kind of urban planning,
A more car-centric approach.
which has its own set of problems, as we know.
Oh, absolutely.
So the story of the grid is full of twists and turns.
It really is. It's a story of innovation, adaptation, and unintended consequences.
And it's a story that's still being written.
Exactly, because now in the 21st century, we're seeing a resurgence of interest in the grid.
Oh, really? So the grid is making a comeback.
It is particularly with the rise of new urbanism.
Before we go any further, could you explain what new urbanism is?
Sure, new urbanism is this planning movement that emphasizes walkability, mixed-use development, and a return to traditional neighborhood designs.
So it's like a reaction against the car-centric sprawl that dominated much of the 20th century.
Exactly. It's about creating cities that are more human scale and less dependent on cars.
And the grid is seen as a way to achieve that.
It can be, yes, when designed properly. The grid can be a powerful tool for creating walkable, vibrant, and sustainable communities.
So it's not about abandoning the grid entirely, but about adapting it for a new era.
Right. It's about rethinking the grid for the 21st century.
That's fascinating. I'm really starting to see the grid in a new light.
Me too. It's a much more complex and nuanced topic than most people realize.
And there's still so much to explore.
Absolutely. We've only just scratched the surface.
Well, let's keep digging then, because I'm eager to learn more about how the grid is being reimagined for the future.
Me too. Let's dive in. Hashtag TTS, the Deep Dive episode 2025-0120, part 2 of 3.
So modern planners are looking at the grid in a whole new way.
Yeah, they're starting to think about it not just as a framework for buildings and roads, but as a system for managing water, promoting biodiversity, and reducing the urban heat island effect.
So it's not just about the built environment, it's about the natural environment too.
Exactly. It's about creating cities that are more integrated with nature.
That sounds like a pretty radical departure from the traditional grid.
It is a shift in thinking. For a long time, the focus was on efficiency and control.
Right, like making sure the traffic flows smoothly and everything has its place.
Exactly. But now there's a growing recognition that we need to think more holistically about urban design.
So instead of trying to dominate nature, we're trying to work with it.
Right. And the grid can actually be a really useful tool for doing that.
Okay, so how does that work in practice? What does a green grid actually look like?
Well, imagine streets that are designed to absorb and filter rainwater.
So instead of just channeling the water away, we're actually letting it soak into the ground.
Exactly. And that helps to replenish groundwater supplies and reduce runoff.
Which is a big problem in cities.
Huge problem. And then you have rooftops that are covered in vegetation.
Green roofs.
Yeah, green roofs help to cool buildings, reduce energy consumption, and provide habitat for wildlife.
And they look pretty cool too.
Yeah, they can really add to the aesthetic of a city.
So we're talking about a grid that's literally green.
Right. And not just green, but also more resilient and sustainable.
One of the sources you sent mentioned the design concept by Shelby Doyle and Tyler Kane called Rethinking the Urban Grid.
Oh, yeah, that's a really interesting one.
They talk about reclaiming space currently used for cars and parking lots for things like stormwater mitigation, bike highways, and public amenities.
Yeah. That's a great example of how we can reimagine the grid. By prioritizing pedestrians and cyclists and integrating nature into the design, we can create cities that are healthier, more resilient, and less dependent on cars.
It's like taking back the streets from cars and giving them back to the people.
Exactly. And it's not just about people, it's about creating a more balanced ecosystem within the city.
So it's this whole interconnected system.
It is. And that's the beauty of the grid when you start thinking about it in these more holistic terms.
I was starting to see the grid in a whole new light. It's not just about straight lines and right angles. It's about how those lines can connect us to each other, to nature, and to a more sustainable future.
That's a great way to put it.
But let's be honest, one of the biggest criticisms of grids is that they can be monotonous and soul-crushing. Do you think there's any truth to that?
I think there can be a kernel of truth to that, but I don't think it's inherent to the grid itself.
So it's not about the grid, it's about how we use it.
Exactly. Even Walt Whitman, back in the 19th century, criticized Manhattan's grid for its monotonous style and lack of connection to the natural landscape.
He had a point. Sometimes walking around a grid city can feel like being trapped in a giant spreadsheet.
I know what you mean.
Mm-hmm.
But I think there are plenty of examples where grids have been adapted to create beautiful and dynamic urban environments.
Like San Francisco?
Yeah, San Francisco is a great example. The grid there conforms to the city's hilly terrain, creating a unique and visually stunning cityscape.
That's true. And even in cities with flatter terrain, the grid can be a canvas for architectural diversity and vibrant street life.
Absolutely. It all comes down to the details.
Yeah.
How we design the buildings, the public spaces, the landscaping, those are the things that give a grid its character and make it a place people want to live in.
So it's not just about the lines themselves, it's about what we do with the spaces in between.
Exactly. And that's where creativity and innovation come in.
So how do we make grids more interesting, more livable, more human?
Well, one approach that's gaining traction is the idea of the modified grid.
Modified grid. What's that?
It's a way of taking the basic principles of the grid order, efficiency, connectivity and adapting them to create more human scale and environmentally friendly urban environments.
It was like a hybrid approach.
You could say that the modified grid allows for more variation in street with block size and building orientation. It might incorporate curves, cul-de-sacs, and green spaces in a way that a strict traditional grid wouldn't.
Are there any real-world examples of this modified grid in action?
Absolutely. The Bastrop Building Block Code in Texas is a great example. They're using a modified grid system to encourage walkability, sustainability, and economic vitality in a way that respects the town's unique character.
So instead of imposing a rigid grid, they're working with the existing landscape and adapting the grid to fit the context.
Precisely. And that's a key principle of good urban design, understanding the site, the history, the community, and designing a grid that responds to those factors.
This is blowing my mind.
Yeah.
It's like the grid is this incredibly versatile tool that we can use to create all sorts of different urban environments.
It is. And we're only just beginning to explore its full potential.
But I have to ask, are there any alternatives to the grid? I mean, is it the only way to design a city?
That's a good question. And it's one that some urban planners and architects have been asking themselves.
I know this might sound crazy, but one of the sources mentioned something about a hexagonal grid. Is that even a real thing?
It is a real concept, though rarely implemented in practice.
So what's the thinking behind that? Why hexagons?
Well, the idea is that a hexagonal grid is more efficient than a rectangular grid from a purely geometrical standpoint.
More efficient in what way?
It provides shorter travel distances between points, and it can pack space more effectively.
That's interesting. But is it practical? I mean, would people actually want to live in a hexagonal city?
That's a good question. Some proponents argue that hexagonal grids could lead to more interesting and varied urban environments.
How so?
Well, imagine streets that converge at 120-degree angles instead of 90-degree angles.
That would create a very different kind of streetscape.
It would be more dynamic and less repetitive. And it could create more opportunities for interesting public spaces.
But wouldn't it be confusing to navigate?
There would definitely be a learning curve. But on the plus side, hexagonal grids could create more organic-feeling public spaces.
Organic in what sense?
Well, hexagons being closer to circles might lend themselves to more natural-feeling parks and plazas.
I guess it's all theoretical at this point, but it's fun to think about the possibilities.
It is. It's a reminder that we don't have to be limited by the conventions of the past.
So we've got the traditional grid, the modified grid, and even the hexagonal grid. Where do you think the future of urban design is headed?
It's hard to say for sure, but I think we're moving towards a more nuanced and context-sensitive approach to urban design.
What do you mean by that?
I think we're starting to realize that there's no one-size-fits-all solution when it comes to designing cities.
So it's not about finding the perfect grid, it's about finding the right grid for the right place.
Exactly, and that means taking into account a whole range of factors: the climate, the topography, the culture, the history, the needs of the community.
So it's a much more holistic approach.
It is,
Yeah.
and it's one that I think is essential if we want to create cities that are truly livable, sustainable, and equitable.
I couldn't agree more. So after this deep dive into city grids, what's the one big takeaway you want our listener to walk away with?
I think the biggest takeaway is that the city grid is a powerful tool that has shaped human civilization for millennia. It can facilitate trait foster community and create a sense of order, But it can also be used to control, segregate, and harm the environment. Ultimately, the grid is a reflection of our values and priorities as a society.
That's a powerful statement.
Yeah.
It's a reminder that even something as seemingly simple as a grid can have profound implications for how we live, work, and interact with each other.
It's about recognizing that design choices aren't neutral. Every line we draw, every street we pave, every building we erect has an impact on the people who live in that space.
So it's not just about aesthetics, it's about ethics.
Exactly. It's about creating cities that are just and equitable for all.
Before we wrap up, I have one final question. What can our listener, who may not be an urban planner or architect, do to help shape the future of their city?
That's a great question. I think the most important thing is to be an informed and engaged citizen. Learn about your city's history, its challenges, and the different approaches to urban design. Pay attention to proposed development projects and make your voice heard.
So it's about being aware, speaking up, and holding our leaders accountable for creating cities that work for everyone.
Absolutely. Support policies that promote sustainable and equitable development. Advocate for more public transportation, green spaces, and affordable housing. And most importantly, imagine the kind of city you want to live in and work towards making that vision a reality.
That's a great note to end on. Be informed, be engaged, and be the change you want to see in your city. So, where do we go from here? I mean, it feels like we're at this crossroads. We can stick with the familiar but flawed grid, try to tweak it, or go for something completely different. What do you think?
It's tough to say for sure. Urban design has always been this evolving thing, and the grid's been around for so long, and it's adapted to so many different contexts, but I think we have to be really careful about how we use it going forward.
Yeah, I mean, we can't just keep repeating the mistakes of the past.
Exactly.
It really feels like it comes down to this,
Yeah.
are we going to prioritize cars and sprawl, or are we going to finally put people and the planet first?
Yeah. I mean, that's the question, isn't it? What kind of cities do we want to live in?
Right.
And what kind of legacy do we want to leave for future generations?
Yeah.
I think the most important thing is to be informed. Learn about your city's history, its challenges, the different approaches to urban design. Pay attention to development projects.
So, get involved in local politics.
Exactly. Make your voice heard. Support policies that promote sustainable development.
Right.
Advocate for public transportation, green spaces, affordable housing.
And I guess most importantly, just imagine the kind of city you want to live in and then fight for it.
Exactly.
Well, this has been an incredible conversation. I've learned so much about city grids. I never realized how complex and fascinating they were.
Me too. It's been a real deep dive.
So to all of our listeners out there, thank you for joining us on this journey into the world of city grids. Be informed, be engaged, and be the change you want to see in your city.
And until next time, keep exploring.